Good day, philosophers. In this video, we're going to actually start reading some Plato. And as we read Plato, you're going to see very quickly that we encounter Socrates as a person. Now, who is Socrates? Socrates was this guy who walked around the city of Athens asking people questions about stuff and asking people to give basic answers to fundamental questions about the things they thought that they knew about. So Socrates was this interesting kind of teacher who walked around and challenged people, and he developed the kind of following of plenty of folks that would listen to him and discuss important things with him, right? Now, so we've got the Socrates who is this kind of teacher. Now, Socrates is this real historical person, but he shows up as a kind of character in Plato's writings. And one of the things you notice very quickly that Plato writes almost like he's writing a play. We call it a dialogue, right? And interestingly enough, Plato was one of the students of Socrates. And in his own writings, he sort of took Socrates as a main speaker to communicate big ideas. Within our course, we'll almost treat what Socrates says as Plato's voice. Though there's many problems with interpreting the text that way, we will, in a somewhat simplified way, sort of treat Socrates as a kind of mouthpiece of Plato. Though arguably Plato's actual philosophy is much more sophisticated than Socrates in some respects. We also, if you notice here in this image, we also have Aristotle. Interestingly enough, Aristotle was one of the students of Plato. And Aristotle was also a teacher. He taught plenty of folks, including Philip the Great. But we have this interesting progression of teacher to student, and so on. But we'll see that Socrates, though, is a teacher unlike other teachers, right? He's not a teacher that has a formal classroom where people come and take notes and stuff like that. He teaches by walking and engaging people in conversation. And that's what we're encountering as we start reading here. In this lecture, we're going to start by, in particular, talking about Platos Euthyphro. So this was a text that you could download, right? Platos Euthyphro. And it will also, in this video and other videos, we'll start talking about Plato's Republic. Sorry, you can't really see my cover here. I've got the CDC Reeve translation. So that's where we're at. But we're going to start by really thinking and talking about Plato's Euthyphro. Okay, so in the Euthyphro, let me go right here. In Plato's Euthyphro, in this text, we encounter Plato walking around the city and talking to a guy whose name was Euthyphro, right? And that's kind of where a lot of Plato's dialogues names come from. It's the name of the person that Socrates is primarily speaking with as he in this particular dialogue. So this is actually considered a very early dialogue. We kind of believe that this is probably one of Plato's most early writings, and probably gives a fairly accurate description of a conversation that maybe happened between Socrates and this guy Euthyphro. But for us, it doesn't really matter. I don't care whether this is historically accurate or not, right? So hopefully by now you've actually read the Euthyphro, right? And so let's kind of talk about what's going on here. We encounter Socrates walking into a trial, right? He's about to go to trial. And interestingly, both Socrates and Euthyphro are both going to this trial for very different reasons, right? So for Socrates is about to go on trial, right? He's going to be on trial as a defendant, right? As a defendant. And while Euthyphro, what's he doing? He's not a defendant. Euthyphro, he is a prosecutor. He is prosecuting someone for a crime. Who's he prosecuting? He's prosecuting his father for what? For murder, right? Crazy, right? So Socrates is some defendant in a trial, while Euthyphro is going to trial to prosecute his own father. Now, how does what's Socrates on trial for? Well, it's not super clear in this dialogue, but in reality, Socrates is on trial for inventing new gods and corrupting the youth. And we'll talk about that kind of charge more in a later lecture. But let's think about Euthyphro. Euthyphro is here, going to prosecute his own father for murder. And so there's a couple of interesting elements for us to think about as we begin to read this dialogue. First of all, how does Socrates react to this kind of thing, right? Socrates says, okay, let's see. Socrates is asking, Euthyphro, what he's doing. And so here, if we are, I'll most often, just as an aside, I most often reference the marginal page numbers as we're looking at a text, because the marginal line numbers, you see these numbers over here, those are the line numbers that are associated with the original Greek text, and those are common to all translations. So you should just be using the translations that I'm posting online. But in the case that you aren't using those, then this will help you follow along with whichever translation you're using. So anyway, if I'm looking at marginal line 4a in Plato's Euthyphro, we'll start seeing here where Socrates, just a little bit above, starts asking Euthyphro what he's doing. And so he says, so what exactly is your suit, Euthyphro? Are you defending or prosecuting? And Euthyphro says, I am prosecuting. Right? Whom? A man by whom I will again appear crazy. But why? Are you pursuing someone who flies? He is a long way from flying, since he happens to be well advanced in years. Who is he? My own father. And then Socrates, I love this. Your father, you fantastic fellow. Right? Absolutely. But what is the charge and what are the circumstances? Murder, Socrates. Heracles. I think most people wouldn't know how to act properly in such a case, since I don't think that just anyone would take care of this correctly, but only someone I suspect who has progressed a long way in wisdom, right? And this is the first part that I want us to reflect on here clearly, right? That when Socrates is encountering Euthyphro, we see Euthyphro doing something that Socrates is kind of shocked that he would be doing, right? That Euthyphro is bringing his own father on trial for a charge of murder. And this is controversial in two respects. In fact, here, let's go back here real quick. This is controversial in two respects, right? So what is Euthyphro doing? Number one, right? He's charging his own father with a crime, right? And so the first thing that's controversial, what's controversial here, is that Euthyphro is bringing a charge against his father, right? And we'll talk about that in just a second. And the second thing is that what he's charging against his father is murder, right? So first is the father part, and second is the murder part. Now let's talk about the murder part first. The first thing that we'll see is if you go on and read the dialogue, and I'd like you to do that, when Euthyphro talks about his father being charged with murder, Socrates is wondering, well, who the heck did your father murder, right? And as it works out, the father murdered someone who was a murderer, right? Long story short, the father had some type of servant / slave / there's all different words that get translated here. But there's someone who is within Greek culture of a different social class. So the father had some type of, say, servant, right? And this servant killed another servant, apparently in drunkenness, or something like that, right? So we've got a servant who gets drunk, kills another servant. The father encounters this, and what does the father do? Father takes that servant and he throws him essentially in a ditch, waiting for a priest to come and help him know what to do. Well, while he's waiting, this servant that murdered someone else, whoa, there goes my computer. The servant that murdered someone else dies, right? And so it's the first thing we'll say here is that within the Greek culture, the father didn't necessarily do anything wrong, right? This isn't necessarily a murder. So in Greek culture, in Greek, in Athens, sort of at this time, this is not a crime. This is what you would kind of have to do, right? That there is not here today in America, if someone committed a crime like murder, then you would call the cops. There's authorities to go to. There's some kind of authorities there, but it doesn't work the same way that it does here, that you have to kind of take more responsibility yourself for these kinds of things. So the first thing is that what this father did might not even be considered actually murder in Greece. Now the second thing, though, is to go back to this whole thing that it was against his father, that Euthyphro is bringing his own father on trial. Now, why is that controversial? Well, in Athens, the father, right? The father is sort of the one who gives you life, right? Your father brings you into existence, right? And so your relationship to your father, your relationship with the father, this is sort of analogous to your relation relation to the gods. Right? That in some ways that your father is the one who brought you into this world, brings life to you, and therefore it's like your relationship to the gods. You owe a certain amount of honor and respect and duty to your father, right? If you even think about this, say you knew someone in your own family who committed a crime, right? This is for some people, this is not a theoretical question. This is a very practical question, and maybe something that has happened before. I've had students tell me all kinds of crazy stories. But say someone like your brother does something. Would you just immediately, turn them in to be prosecuted for the crime? Well, maybe it depends. Maybe you're saying it depends on the crime. Okay. What if it was a crime of murder, right? Would you immediately turn in your brother for a crime, even a very serious one? Maybe not. Would you turn in your neighbor if you knew that they did it? Would you turn in someone that you knew did it that was like a coworker, right? Well, the closeness of your relationship to your family and to your father in particular in Athens suggests that you wouldn't, even if your father did commit a crime like murder, you would never be the one to turn that your own father in. And it's extremely bold of you to do that. And so this is why Socrates, his first reaction is to say that when he hears of Euthyphro's actions, that he must be someone who has progressed a long way in wisdom, right? That he is not like a normal folk, right? And so actually, if we look at this reveals a fundamental assumption about knowledge and action in general when we look at Socrates. That if you are going to act confidently, to do something like this, you must have knowledge, right? That you must be a wise person to understand things, right? And that, as we'll see, that knowledge is going to be fundamentally based on grasping a definition, right? So let's come back to this in just a second. Let's look at the text again, right? So there's another nice spot here that's worth looking at here. Socrates, hears all about how his father is the circumstances of this charge of murder and all this. And so Socrates says, but before Zeus, Euthyphro, and again, I apologize, this is around marginal line 4E and then 5A, Socrates says, but before Zeus, Euthyphro, do you think that you have such accurate knowledge about how the religious laws stand and about piety and impiety that these things having taken place in the way you describe, you are not afraid that by prosecuting your father, you in truth might be committing an impiety? Right? And then Euthyphro says, this is great. I love this. This is cool what happens here. Euthyphro says, I would be of no use, Socrates. And neither would Euthyphro be better than the majority of men if I did not have accurate knowledge of all such matters. Right? And I love how Euthyphro goes into the third person there. It's kind of fun, right? But he says, what? Euthyphro says, I'm better than the majority of men. Why? Because I have accurate knowledge. If we go back to these assumptions, right? When Socrates is looking at what it takes to be confident in action, Socrates ultimately thinks that our only real confidence comes from the knowledge that we have. And Euthyphro claims that he has this. So here's this fun thing, right? That how does Socrates react when he hears Euthyphro say that he must have this knowledge, right? He says, so in that case, it would be excellent for me to become a student of yours, marvelous Euthyphro. And then he continues reading. But there's this great thing that when Socrates looks at Euthyphro and what Euthyphro is claiming to do here, that the only way he could be right in doing this, the only way Euthyphro could be right in prosecuting his own father is that if Euthyphro is wise. The only way he could be right. And what is for Euthyphro to be someone who would be wise. Why would Euthyphro have to be wise? Because Euthyphro is doing something that goes completely against Athenian culture. Number one, he's bringing his own father on trial. And number two, he's bringing his own father on trial for a crime that he calls murder, but probably no one else will. So how is this trial probably going to go for Euthyphro? Socrates thinks that at first, Euthyphro probably has almost no chance of being successful here. But if there's any chance of being successful, the only reason he'd be able to be successful is that if Euthyphro was himself wise. And so what does Socrates say? Socrates says, I will become your teacher. Not be your teacher. Socrates says, I will become your pupil. Socrates will become Euthyphro's, and that little E with the period means Euthyphro, Euthyphro's pupil, right? Now, this is a kind of funny thing, because remember how just a minute ago, how I was talking about how Socrates was someone who was a teacher, right? Socrates is a famous teacher of philosophy, and one of his most famous students was Plato. If Socrates is claiming to become the pupil of Euthyphro, does that mean that Socrates learns from Euthyphro and then passes on that knowledge to Plato? That's not how it plays out, actually. And there's some funny elements here if we think about it. That when Socrates becomes the pupil of Euthyphro, he's not a pupil like as in terms of a passive pupil. Like what do we mean by talking about a pupil here? Socrates is not passive. In other words, he doesn't just presume that the teacher has this wisdom that the teacher is just going to share. No, right? Socrates is going to interrogate his teacher, right? He interrogates, what am I writing here? Interrogates his teacher, right? And so, interestingly enough, that in fact, as Socrates claims to become the pupil of Euthyphro, he actually is fundamentally becoming his teacher, right? And so there's this interesting little interplay that happens there as we read the rest of this dialogue. We'll see that Socrates is not this person who's just interested in learning what Euthyphro has to teach. He actually is interested in teaching Euthyphro a couple of fundamental lessons. First, a fundamental lesson about what it really means to claim that you have accurate knowledge of things, right? And a fundamental lesson about himself, about his attitude towards being someone who's so wise. Notice Euthyphro is extraordinarily confident. Euthyphro has amazing confidence, and Socrates says that confidence can only come from knowledge, but you need to really know what it means to know. What are we doing now? We're getting just a little bit of epistemology thrown in here now, my friends. So we're going to get a bunch of epistemology. So what we're going to have to do is analyze a little bit more carefully exactly what it looks like when Socrates becomes a pupil. In fact, he's actually not this passive pupil. He's actually becoming someone who is teaching a lesson, right? And the fundamental lesson that we're going to see here is what we see there, that knowledge is ultimately based on grasping a definition. Socrates has one question as being the pupil of Euthyphro. Socrates' question. What does he ask? Socrates asks, what is piety? What is piety? And that is what Euthyphro is supposed to teach Socrates, piety. Why piety? Well, piety is this kind of description of thinking about how we relate to the gods, right? And therefore how we relate to our own father. That Socrates is really questioning Euthyphro's, again, action against his own father. And he's challenging whether Euthyphro really, really knows what piety is. And one thing I want to say here before I close out this video, we'll close in just a second, is that a lot of people tend to think that Socrates has no respect for Euthyphro. But I think that actually Socrates is kind of interesting here. When Socrates says that Euthyphro would have to be wise, as we'll find out in this text, Euthyphro is not wise. Euthyphro doesn't actually know what piety is. He is not able to give an answer. But I think Socrates actually is impressed by Euthyphro, at least by the potentiality here. I think Socrates might actually think that Euthyphro is right in prosecuting his own father for murder. Socrates might actually think that Euthyphro is onto something. He's just, as we'll see, disappointed by the outcome that Euthyphro, even if Euthyphro is stumbling upon the right thing, he doesn't actually know what the right thing is. And that's something that we'll talk about in the next video. Next video, we'll talk about this priority of this question about what it means to know and what Socrates means by knowing. Okay, so I'll check you in the next lecture. Have a beautiful day.